The search dogs refused to go past the tree line, whimpering and backing away from something their handlers couldn't see. Sheriff Coleman Briggs stood at the edge of Whisper Creek Trail on that fog-shrouded morning in October 1947, watching his best bloodhounds cower like beaten puppies at the scent they'd been tracking for 3 days straight. What happened in those Tennessee mountains would become one of America's most disturbing, unsolved mysteries. A case that law enforcement tried desperately to bury, and locals still refused to discuss. After more than 70 years, the trail had gone cold at exactly the same spot where 17 other search parties would meet the same terrifying dead end over the next decade. Briggs adjusted his wool coat against the mountain chill, studying the dense canopy of oak and hickory that seemed to swallow the morning light. The missing campers, the Henderson family from Nashville, had last been seen entering these woods 4 days earlier. Their brand new Buick parked neatly at the Whisper Creek trailhead with camping gear still strapped to the roof. "Dogs won't budge past that big oak there," Deputy Marshal Stevens called out, his voice echoing strangely in the hollow. Same as yesterday, same as the day before. It's like they hit an invisible wall. The oak tree Stevens referenced stood nearly 6 feet in diameter, its gnarled branches creating an archway over the narrow trail. Carved into its bark, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were symbols that predated any Cherokee markings known to regional historians. Local folklore whispered about the Crane family mountain people who'd lived in these hollows since before the Civil War, who some claimed had never truly accepted outsiders venturing into their territory. Briggs had heard the stories, of course. Every lawman in eastern Tennessee knew about the isolated cabin tucked away in Devil's Backbone Ridge, where smoke still rose from the chimney, despite no one having seen the Cranes in town for months. The family kept to themselves, emerging only to trade moonshine and preserved meats with a select few mountain folk who honored the old ways. But missing tourists? That was something entirely different. The Henderson family, Robert, his wife Dorothy, and their twin boys aged 12, represented the new wave of recreational camping sweeping America in the post-war boom. Robert had purchased the latest Coleman camping equipment, studied topographical maps, and planned their 3-day adventure with military precision. His final postcard to Dorothy's sister, mailed from the general store in Millfield, just 2 miles from the trailhead, read simply, "Weather perfect, boys excited, beautiful country up here, home Sunday." That was Monday, October 13th, 1947. Briggs crouched beside the lead bloodhound, a 7-year-old Tennessee Walker hound named Duke, who'd tracked down more fugitives than any dog in the county. Duke's hackles remained raised, his dark eyes fixed on the trail ahead with an intensity that made the sheriff's skin crawl. The dog had picked up the Henderson family's scent immediately at their abandoned Buick clothing items, food remnants. Even little Tommy Henderson's baseball glove provided clear tracking material. The trail led steadily upward for nearly 2 miles, past the old logging road, beyond the abandoned copper mine, deep into territory where few modern visitors ever ventured. Evidence of the family's passage remained clear. Broken twigs at exactly the height of the camping packs, boot prints in soft earth, even a candy wrapper that matched the brands found in their car. Everything pointed toward the heart of Devil's Backbone Ridge. Everything pointed toward the Crane family's domain. "Sheriff, you might want to see this," Stevens called from 20 yards up the trail. He knelt beside a fallen log, pointing to something pressed into the moss. A child's sneaker print, small enough to belong to one of the Henderson twins, alongside what appeared to be bare feet, adult-sized bare feet with unusually long toes that left deep impressions in the damp earth. The morning mist seemed to thicken as Briggs approached the prints, carrying with it a scent he couldn't quite identify, something organic and wild, like wet fur mixed with wood smoke and something else. Something that reminded him uncomfortably of the slaughterhouse outside town. As the sheriff photographed the strange footprints, a sound drifted down from the ridge above. Faint but unmistakable, the rhythmic thunk of an axe, splitting wood, echoing through the hollow like a funeral bell. Someone was home at the Crane cabin. Someone was expecting visitors. Before you continue this journey into the mountains, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If this story is already getting under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe, because what we uncover next will challenge everything you thought you knew about what happens when civilized people venture too deep into wild places. But first, we need to understand exactly who the Crane family was and why local Cherokee elders crossed themselves whenever someone mentioned Devil's Backbone Ridge. Ezekiel Crane built his cabin in 1862 with lumber cut from trees that still bore Cherokee prayer marks, and the mountain folk say the land never forgave him for it. The first recorded death on Devil's Backbone Ridge happened before the cabin's foundation had even cured Ezekiel's own brother Samuel, found at the bottom of a ravine with his neck twisted at an impossible angle. Understanding the Crane family means understanding why 3 generations of Tennessee law enforcement had learned to look the other way when travelers disappeared in those mountains. The original land grant, filed with Hamilton County in 1859, described Devil's Backbone Ridge as unsuitable for cultivation, prone to landslides, and inhabited by hostile wildlife. What the surveyor's report didn't mention were the Cherokee warnings about the ridge stories passed down about a place where the earth itself had grown sick from old blood. The Cherokee had abandoned their seasonal hunting grounds there after a series of unexplained disappearances in the 1700s, marking the area as cursed ground, where the spirits of the dead walked freely among the living. Ezekiel Crane didn't believe in Cherokee superstitions. He believed in isolation, in keeping his family's business away from prying government eyes, and in the kind of mountain justice that didn't require judges or juries. By 1865, strange stories began filtering down from the ridge. Travelers who ventured up the old Cherokee Trail spoke of hearing screams echoing through the hollows at night, of finding animal bones arranged in deliberate patterns around their campsites, of being watched by eyes that reflected firelight from distances no human should have been able to cover. The Crane family grew during Reconstruction, but not in ways that made sense to their neighbors in the valley below. Ezekiel took a wife, a Cherokee woman named Ayanna, who'd been cast out by her own people for reasons no one would discuss. Their children multiplied with suspicious speed, and visitors to the general store in Millfield began reporting encounters with Crane offspring who didn't seem quite right, too tall for their apparent age, too quiet, too willing to stare without blinking until grown men looked away first. They got the devil's own eyes, wrote Methodist preacher Josiah Whitman in his 1873 journal, discovered years later in the basement of the Millfield Church. Saw 3 of the Crane young ones at the trading post today. Couldn't tell if they was boys or girls. Couldn't tell how old they might be. But when the littlest one looked at me, I felt something cold walk across my grave. The Cherokee woman, Ayanna, she just smiled and counted out her coins like nothing was amiss. But them children, Lord preserve us. Them children ain't natural. The first official investigation into the Crane family came in 1878, when a circuit judge named Cornelius Beck disappeared while traveling between Millfield and the county seat in Chattanooga. Beck's horse returned to town 3 days later, still saddled, but wild-eyed and foaming at the mouth. Search parties found Beck's overturned buggy at the base of Devil's Backbone Ridge, but no sign of the judge himself. Hamilton County Sheriff Marcus Donovan organized a formal search of the Crane property, the first and last time law enforcement would attempt such an action for nearly 70 years. What happened during that search was documented in Donovan's official report. Though the original files mysteriously vanished from county records sometime in the 1920s, a copy surfaced in 1941, tucked inside the personal effects of retiring Deputy Sheriff Thomas Millbrook. According to Donovan's account, his 7-man posse reached the Crane cabin on September 21, 1878, at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. They found Ezekiel Crane sitting on his front porch, whittling a piece of hickory wood with a knife that Donovan described as longer than any man had need for. The conversation, as recorded by Donovan, went like this: "Mr. Crane, we're looking for Judge Beck. His buggy was found at the bottom of your ridge. Lots of things get found at the bottom of ridges, Sheriff. Lots of things get lost up top, too. Are you saying you haven't seen the judge?" "I'm saying these mountains eat what they're hungry for. Always have." Cherokee knew that. Smart folks still know it. When Donovan's posse searched the property, they found evidence that chilled them to the bone. Behind the cabin, in a clearing surrounded by ancient oaks, they discovered what appeared to be a family cemetery. But instead of proper headstones, the graves were marked with carved wooden posts bearing symbols that made the Cherokee members of their group refuse to look directly at them. More disturbing were the dates carved into the posts, some going back to the 1700s, decades before Ezekiel had ever set foot on the ridge. The search party also discovered a root cellar beneath the cabin that extended far deeper than any food storage required. Deputy Millbrook's personal notes, written years later, described the smell rising from that cellar as sweet and wrong, like meat left too long in summer heat, but underneath something else, something that made you think of things that should stay buried. They never found Judge Beck's body. They never found evidence of a crime. But when Ezekiel Crane smiled at Sheriff Donovan as the posse prepared to leave, Donovan noticed that several of the man's teeth had been filed to points. By 1880, a pattern had emerged that would persist for the next 6 decades. Travelers disappeared near Devil's Backbone Ridge with disturbing regularity, roughly one every 18 months, always during the warmer months when camping and hiking drew people into the mountains. Local authorities learned to conduct perfunctory searches that never quite reached the Crane property. Records were misfiled. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses developed sudden reluctance to testify. The Crane family had become untouchable, protected not by law, but by something far more primitive: the mountain understanding that some things were better left alone. But in October 1947, when the Henderson family vanished, Sheriff Coleman Briggs didn't yet understand the unwritten rules that had kept an uneasy peace in those mountains for nearly 70 years. What could possess a man to break a treaty written in blood and silence, when doing so might wake something that had been sleeping in those mountains since before Tennessee was even a state? Sheriff Coleman Briggs made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At exactly 11:47 a.m. on October 16th, 1947, when he loaded his service revolver and told Deputy Stevens they were going up to Devil's Backbone Ridge with or without the dogs. The morning frost crunched under their boots as they abandoned protocol and crossed into territory that 3 generations of lawmen had learned to avoid. What Briggs discovered in the next 4 hours would shatter every assumption he'd held about the nature of evil, and prove that some family traditions are too terrible to survive in civilized society. The hike to the Crane cabin took nearly 2 hours through terrain that seemed designed to discourage visitors. The old Cherokee Trail switched back through dense undergrowth, where visibility dropped to mere yards, forcing the 2 lawmen to navigate by compass and instinct. Ancient rhododendron thickets created natural tunnels that blocked out the sun, while the sound of their footsteps seemed to echo from directions that made no geographical sense. Stevens noticed at first the absolute silence. No bird songs, no insect buzz, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The forest around Devil's Backbone Ridge had gone as quiet as a cathedral during funeral prayers. Even their own breathing sounded unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness that seemed to press against their eardrums like cotton. "Sheriff," Stevens whispered, his voice barely audible, "you smell that?" The scent had been building gradually as they climbed higher wood smoke mixed with something organic and sweetly rotten, like overripe fruit left too long in summer heat. But underneath lay another odor that made both men unconsciously breathe through their mouths. It smelled like the aftermath of a slaughterhouse, metallic and thick, with an undertone that reminded Briggs uncomfortably of the battlefield hospitals he'd worked in during the Great War. The Crane cabin materialized out of the mist, like something from a fever dream. Built from massive chestnut logs blackened with age and weather, the structure seemed to crouch against the mountainside as if hiding from divine judgment. Smoke rose from a stone chimney that had been built too tall, creating an ominous silhouette against the gray October sky. No windows faced the approaching trail, an architectural choice that suggested the inhabitants preferred to see visitors coming while remaining unseen themselves. Briggs checked his pocket watch. 1:15 p.m. The Henderson family had been missing for 5 days. "Hello, the house," he called out, following mountain protocol for approaching isolated dwellings. His voice seemed to die just yards from his lips, swallowed by the unnatural quiet that surrounded the clearing. Movement flickered at the edge of his vision. A figure emerged from behind the cabin, tall, gaunt, wearing clothes that might have been fashionable during the Cleveland administration. The man's hair hung past his shoulders in gray ropes, and his beard reached nearly to his belt. But it was his eyes that made both lawmen instinctively rest their hands on their sidearms. They were the pale blue of winter ice, and they never seemed to blink. "You'd be Sheriff Briggs," the man said, his voice carrying the peculiar accent of mountain folk who rarely descended to the valleys below. "Been expecting you since Monday. Mr. Crane, I assume? Jeremiah Crane. Ezekiel's boy, though he's been in the ground these 30 years. The man smiled, revealing teeth that had been deliberately sharpened to points of modification that turned his grin into something predatory. "You're here about the family from Nashville." Stevens stepped slightly behind Briggs, his hand now openly resting on his pistol grip. The deputy had grown up hearing stories about the Cranes, tales his grandmother had whispered about mountain folk who'd made bargains with things that predated Cherokee spirits. Looking at Jeremiah Crane's filed teeth and ice-cold stare, those childhood nightmares suddenly seemed entirely plausible. "The Henderson family was last seen heading toward this ridge," Briggs said, trying to keep his voice steady and official. "Their car is still parked at the trailhead. We have reason to believe they may have gotten lost in this area." "Lost," Jeremiah repeated the word as if tasting it. "Interesting choice of language, Sheriff. Lots of things get lost up here. Question is whether they want to be found." The smell grew stronger as they talked, that sickly sweet reek of decay mixed with wood smoke and something else. Something that made Briggs think of rendering plants and medical waste. Behind Jeremiah, the cabin door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness within. "I'd like permission to search your property, Mr. Crane," Briggs said, producing a warrant he'd had Judge Morrison sign that morning. "Standard procedure in missing persons cases." Jeremiah's laugh sounded like wind through dead leaves. "Search warrant. Now that's a piece of paper I haven't seen in quite some time." He accepted the document with fingers that seemed too long for human hands, scanning it with obvious amusement. "Judge Morrison, eh?" His grandfather knew better than to put pen to paper regarding Crane business. "But times change, don't they, Sheriff?" The mountain man stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, gesturing toward his cabin with a theatrical bow. "Search away, lawman. But I should warn you some things. Once seen can't be unseen. Some knowledge has a way of following a man home." As they approached the cabin's front porch, Briggs noticed details that made his skin crawl. The wooden planks were stained dark, in patterns that looked suspiciously like old bloodstains. Bundles of what appeared to be herbs hung from the eaves, but the plants gave off a nauseating smell that had nothing in common with any folk remedies he knew. Most disturbing were the wind chimes, if they could be called, that made from what looked like finger bones and teeth, creating a subtle clicking sound that seemed to whisper just below the threshold of hearing. Stevens grabbed his arm as they reached the door. "Sheriff," he hissed, "look at the threshold." The wooden doorframe bore carved symbols that hurt to look at directly. geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally. But more disturbing were the dark stains ground into the wood grain, as if countless feet had tracked blood across that threshold over many years. Jeremiah Crane stood watching them with obvious amusement, his filed teeth gleaming in the pale afternoon light. "Something troubling you, deputies? We're simple mountain folk here. Nothing to fear from honest law enforcement." Briggs drew his service revolver as he pushed open the cabin door. The darkness inside seemed to recoil from the gray daylight like a living thing, and the smell that rolled out made both men gag involuntarily. What they found in that cabin would determine whether the Henderson family tragedy became just another unsolved case in the Tennessee mountains, or whether Sheriff Coleman Briggs would become the first lawman in 70 years to challenge the unwritten treaty that kept the Crane family's monstrous appetites hidden from civilized society. But some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The first thing Sheriff Briggs saw in the candlelit gloom was a dinner table set for 7 people, with plates that looked like they hadn't been touched for days, but still contained what appeared to be fresh meat. The second thing he noticed made him forget about proper police procedure. Entirely hanging from the cabin's rafters were clothes that matched exactly what Dorothy Henderson had been wearing when her family disappeared. What happened in the next 17 minutes would prove that some crimes transcend human understanding, entering territory where law enforcement training becomes utterly inadequate. The interior of the Crane cabin defied every expectation of mountain poverty. Instead of the rough-hewn simplicity typical of Appalachian homes, the space had been divided into multiple rooms with walls covered in what appeared to be animal hides, stitched together with disturbingly uniform precision. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames, creating an atmosphere that made both lawmen feel like they were walking through a living nightmare. Deputy Stevens pointed his flashlight beam toward the far wall, illuminating a collection that made his stomach lurch. Dozens of personal items hung from wooden pegs, watches, jewelry, clothing, camping gear, arranged with the methodical care of a museum exhibition. Briggs recognized a child's baseball cap that matched the description of Tommy Henderson's favorite Cubs hat. Next to it hung a woman's pearl necklace that perfectly matched the one Dorothy Henderson had been wearing in the family photograph her sister had provided. "Mr. Crane," Briggs called over his shoulder, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, "I need you to explain these items." Jeremiah's laugh drifted through the doorway like smoke. "Folks lose things in the mountains, Sheriff. We Cranes have always been collectors of lost treasures. Waste not, want not, as my grandfather used to say." The dining area revealed even more disturbing details. The table had been carved from a single massive oak trunk, its surface polished smooth by generations of use, and stained dark, with substances that looked suspiciously organic. 7 mismatched chairs surrounded it, each bearing personal items that clearly belonged to different missing persons cases spanning decades. A child's wooden toy horse sat on one chair, while another held a man's pocket watch with initials that Briggs didn't recognize. But it was the kitchen that made both men realize they had stumbled into something far worse than a simple missing persons case. The cast iron stove dominated the back wall, its surface still warm to the touch despite no visible fire burning within. Above it, hooks and chains hung from the ceiling beams in arrangements that reminded Briggs uncomfortably of the meatpacking plants in Chicago. Fresh cuts of what appeared to be venison hung from several hooks, but the meat looked wrong somehow, too pale, with an unnatural marbling that made Stevens turn away and retch quietly into his handkerchief. "Jesus Christ," Stevens whispered, pointing his flashlight toward a wooden cutting block that dominated the kitchen's center island. Dark stains covered its surface in patterns that suggested heavy, repeated use. Cleaver marks scarred the wood so deeply that they'd created permanent grooves, while rusty brown stains had soaked into the grain so thoroughly that no amount of scrubbing could remove them. A root cellar door stood slightly ajar behind the stove, revealing wooden steps that disappeared into absolute darkness. The smell rising from below made both men gag that same sickly sweet odor of decay they'd noticed approaching the cabin, but concentrated now to an almost overwhelming degree. Something down there was very wrong, and had been wrong for a very long time. Briggs descended 3 steps into the cellar before his flashlight beam revealed horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The underground chamber had been expanded far beyond normal root cellar dimensions, creating a warren of interconnected rooms carved directly into the mountain bedrock. The walls were lined with wooden shelves that held mason jars filled with substances he preferred not to identify, while the floor was covered in what appeared to be sawdust that had been stained dark with repeated soakings of organic material. But it was the far corner that made him understand exactly what had happened to the Henderson family. 4 sleeping bags lay arranged in a neat row, exactly matching the Coleman camping equipment that Robert Henderson had purchased for their mountain adventure. 3 of the bags appeared to have been slept in recently, while the 4th showed signs of violent struggle, torn fabric, scattered contents, and dark stains that hadn't had time to dry completely. "Sheriff," Stevens called from upstairs, his voice cracking with panic. "You need to see this, now." Briggs climbed back to the main floor to find his deputy standing frozen in the cabin's back room, staring at something that made his face go dead white. The room had been set up as sleeping quarters, with 4 simple cots arranged against the walls. But it wasn't the primitive accommodations that had terrified Stevens. It was what lay on the beds. Personal belongings from the Henderson family covered each cot in neat arrangements, as if someone had been carefully sorting through their possessions. Robert's wallet lay open on one bed, displaying his driver's license and family photographs. Dorothy's purse had been emptied on another, her lipstick and compact arranged with obsessive precision. The twin boys' belongings occupied the remaining 2 beds, comic books, toy soldiers, and clothing that still carried the scent of a middle-class Nashville home. "Where are they?" Briggs demanded, spinning to face Jeremiah Crane, who had silently entered the cabin behind them. "Where is the Henderson family?" The mountain man's ice-blue eyes seemed to glow in the lamplight as he smiled his predatory smile. "Why, Sheriff, they're here. They've always been here. This is where travelers come to stay when they lose their way in our mountains." Stevens drew his revolver with shaking hands. "You killed them. You murdered that entire family." "Killed?" Jeremiah tilted his head like a curious bird. Such harsh language for natural mountain hospitality. "The Hendersons are part of our family now, part of our traditions, part of what keeps the old ways alive in these hills." At exactly 3:42 p.m., Sheriff Coleman Briggs made the second decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of arresting Jeremiah Crane on suspicion of multiple homicides, instead of calling for backup, instead of following any recognizable police procedure, he did something that no lawman in Hamilton County had attempted for nearly 70 years. He decided to learn the full truth about what the Crane family had been doing to visitors in these mountains since 1862. But some truths carry a price that transforms the seeker as much as the sought. And in the gathering darkness of Devil's Backbone Ridge, Sheriff Briggs was about to discover why previous generations of law enforcement had chosen willful ignorance over absolute knowledge. Jeremiah Crane led them deeper into the cabin's bowels with the casual confidence of a man showing off his life's work, and what Sheriff Briggs saw in the next chamber made him understand why the Cherokee had abandoned these mountains centuries ago. The underground room stretched far beyond what should have been possible, carved into living rock and lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across walls, covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly. This was where Sheriff Briggs learned that some family traditions are too ancient and too terrible to be stopped by badges and warrants. The chamber revealed the true scope of the Crane family's activities over 8 decades of isolation. Along the walls, wooden shelves held mason jars containing what appeared to be preserved organs, each carefully labeled with dates going back to the 1870s. Briggs recognized some of the handwriting from missing persons reports that had crossed his desk over the years. Names of travelers who had disappeared during camping trips or hunting expeditions. Their cases eventually filed away as accidental deaths or simple disappearances. 85 years of mountain hospitality, Jeremiah said with obvious pride, gesturing toward the macabre collection. My grandfather Ezekiel started the tradition, but we've refined it considerably over the generations. The Cherokee taught us about using every part of what the mountain provides. We just expanded their philosophy to include unexpected guests. Deputy Stevens backed against the stone wall, his service revolver trembling in his grip. The young man had grown up on sanitized stories about frontier justice and mountain feuds, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the clinical precision of what they were witnessing. This wasn't the work of backwoods savages. It was systematic, methodical, and had been perfected over multiple generations. The far end of the chamber revealed the fate of recent visitors to Devil's Backbone Ridge. A wooden table, similar to the kitchen cutting block, but larger and more elaborate, dominated the space. Dark stains covered its surface in patterns that suggested repeated use, while channels carved into its edges directed fluids toward collection vessels positioned around its base. Leather straps at strategic positions made its primary function horrifyingly clear. The Henderson family, Briggs managed, his voice barely above a whisper. What did you do to them? Jeremiah's filed teeth gleamed in the lamplight as he smiled. The Hendersons provided excellent meat for our winter stores. The father was particularly robust, good muscle tone from his office work in Nashville. The mother was more tender, better for special occasions. The boys, he paused, savoring the memory. Children always taste best. Something about innocence, I believe. Stevens vomited against the wall, his flashlight clattering to the stone floor. The sound echoed through the chamber like gunshots, while shadows danced wildly across the preserved horror surrounding them. Briggs fought down his own nausea, forcing himself to continue the investigation that had already revealed more than any human should have to witness. You're under arrest for murder, he said, drawing his revolver with hands that shook despite his years of law enforcement experience. Multiple counts of murder in the first degree. Jeremiah's laugh echoed through the chamber like the cry of some nocturnal predator. Arrest? Oh, Sheriff Briggs, you still don't understand the arrangement your predecessors worked out with my family. We provide a service. We keep the Cherokee spirits quiet. We maintain the old boundaries. We ensure that certain kinds of people never make it back to civilization to spread stories about things they shouldn't have seen. The mountain man stepped closer, moving with the fluid grace of someone perfectly comfortable in his element. Do you think it was coincidence that brought the Hendersons to our trail? Do you imagine they simply got lost and wandered into our territory by accident? We've been guiding selected visitors to Devil's Backbone Ridge for 3 generations, Sheriff. People who ask too many questions about Indian burial grounds. People who poke around old Cherokee sites looking for artifacts. People who need to disappear for the greater good of keeping certain secrets buried. Briggs felt the world tilting around him as implications crashed through his mind. You're talking about murder for hire. You're saying someone paid you to kill the Henderson family? Paid? Jeremiah seemed genuinely amused. Sheriff, we don't work for money. We work for understanding, for preservation of the old ways. The Cherokee spirits told us decades ago that certain bloodlines needed to be interrupted. Certain curiosities needed to be satisfied before they could spread. The Hendersons had been asking questions about Cherokee burial sites around Nashville, planning to bring archaeological expeditions into sensitive areas. The revelation hit Briggs like a physical blow. Robert Henderson had mentioned archaeological interests in his missing person report. His wife had described him as an amateur historian, fascinated by Native American culture. Someone had specifically targeted the family, had guided them toward the Crane territory, had arranged their disappearance to prevent them from disturbing sites that were meant to remain hidden. "Who?" he demanded. "Who's been working with you?" But Jeremiah Crane's attention had shifted to something behind the sheriff. Footsteps echoed from the chamber entrance, multiple sets of feet descending the wooden stairs with deliberate precision. Voices drifted through the darkness, speaking in the mountain dialect that Briggs recognized but couldn't quite understand. "Ah," Jeremiah said with satisfaction. "The rest of the family is home from their hunting trip. Sheriff, I'd like you to meet my sons, Jacob, Isaiah, and Nehemiah, and my daughters, Ruth and Esther. They've been tracking another group of visitors who've been asking inconvenient questions about our mountain." 5 figures emerged from the shadows, each bearing the distinctive Crane family features: pale blue eyes, unnaturally tall frames, and teeth that had been deliberately sharpened to predatory points. They moved with the coordinated precision of wolves, surrounding Briggs and Stevens with practiced ease. The oldest son, Jacob, carried a hunting rifle that looked like it had seen considerable use. "Father, these lawmen have been asking questions in town. The Cherokee spirits are restless. They say it's time to feed the mountain again." Sheriff Coleman Briggs realized that his investigation into the Henderson family disappearance had led him into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple murder case. He was standing in the heart of a conspiracy that stretched back generations, involving people he trusted and institutions he'd served faithfully for 15 years. But in the lamp-lit darkness of that underground chamber, with the Crane family closing in around him like predators cornering wounded prey, Briggs faced a choice that would determine not only his own survival, but whether the truth about Devil's Backbone Ridge would ever see daylight. Jacob Crane's rifle barrel pressed against Sheriff Briggs' temple with the cold certainty of death, while the other family members formed a perfect circle around the 2 trapped lawmen, like wolves, who had finally cornered their prey after a long hunt. In the flickering lamplight of that underground chamber, Briggs could see that each of the Crane children bore scars that looked ritualistic, deliberate markings that suggested their initiation into the family business had involved considerably more than simple participation. What happened in the next 23 minutes would determine whether the truth about Devil's Backbone Ridge died with 2 Hamilton County deputies, or whether Sheriff Briggs would find a way to break a conspiracy that had protected the Crane family's monstrous appetites for nearly a century. "Easy now, Jacob," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying the authority of a patriarch who had spent decades managing delicate situations. "These gentlemen deserve to understand the full scope of their situation before we proceed with traditional mountain hospitality. Sheriff Briggs has been asking such interesting questions, it would be rude not to provide complete answers." Deputy Stevens had pressed himself against the stone wall, his service revolver still drawn, but shaking so violently that accurate shooting would have been impossible. The young man's eyes kept darting between the preserved horrors lining the chamber walls and the predatory faces surrounding him. Briggs could hear his deputy's breathing, becoming rapid, and shallow hyperventilation brought on by shock and terror. "The Henderson family wasn't random," Jeremiah continued, settling into what appeared to be a well-practiced monologue. Robert Henderson had been corresponding with professors at Vanderbilt University about Cherokee burial sites in Davidson County. His letters mentioned specific locations that have been protected for over a century, places where certain things are buried that need to stay buried. The mountain man produced a leather portfolio from somewhere within his coat, opening it to reveal correspondence that made Briggs' blood run cold. Official letterheads from the Tennessee Historical Commission, carbon copies of archaeological survey requests, and most damning of all, responses from government offices that Briggs recognized. Dr. Marcus Whitfield at the State Archaeological Department has been quite helpful over the years, Jeremiah said, his filed teeth gleaming. Whenever amateur historians or curious treasure hunters get too close to sensitive sites, Dr. Whitfield provides us with their names and planned expeditions. In exchange, those sites remain undisturbed, and certain Cherokee artifacts stay safely buried where they belong. The implications crashed through Briggs' mind like dominoes falling. Dr. Whitfield was a respected academic who had consulted on several missing persons cases over the years. His expert testimony had helped classify numerous disappearances as accidental deaths caused by unfamiliarity with dangerous mountain terrain. If Whitfield was actively directing potential victims toward the Crane family, then the conspiracy extended far beyond isolated mountain folk into the highest levels of Tennessee's academic and governmental institutions. Judge Morrison knows, Briggs said, the words emerging as more statement than question. Judge Morrison's grandfather signed the original agreement with my great-grandfather in 1879, Jeremiah confirmed. After that unfortunate business with Sheriff Donovan's search party, local authorities realized that some accommodations needed to be made. The Cranes would maintain their traditional lifestyle in exchange for providing disposal services for people who pose threats to regional stability. Ruth Crane, the youngest daughter, stepped forward with movements that reminded Briggs of a stalking cat. She appeared to be in her 20s, but her pale blue eyes held depths of cruelty that suggested decades of participation in her family's activities. Father, the Cherokee spirits grow impatient. They've been calling for fresh blood since the harvest moon. These lawmen would make fine additions to our winter stores. The casual discussion of their impending deaths galvanized something deep within Sheriff Briggs' survival instincts. His 15 years of law enforcement experience had taught him to recognize the moment when negotiation ended and violence became inevitable. The Crane family wasn't planning to release them. They were simply enjoying the process of explaining their methodology before adding 2 more law enforcement officers to their collection of victims. Stevens, he said quietly, when I move, empty your cylinder toward the oil lamps. Create as much darkness as you can. His deputy's terrified nod was barely perceptible, but Briggs caught it. The young man had enough training to understand that their only chance lay in disrupting the Cranes' tactical advantage, their intimate familiarity with the underground chamber's layout. Jeremiah seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Sheriff, I hope you're not contemplating anything foolish. My family has survived in these mountains for 8 decades by being very, very good at what we do. Lawmen have attempted resistance before. Their bones fertilize our garden. How many? Briggs asked, partly to buy time, and partly because he needed to understand the full scope of what he was facing. How many law enforcement officers have disappeared in these mountains, including yourselves? Jeremiah appeared to calculate mentally. 14, I believe, plus various federal agents, state investigators, and one particularly persistent private detective from Knoxville who had theories about missing campers. The mountain spirits appreciate variety in their diet. Isaiah Crane, the middle son, had moved to block the chamber's only exit while his siblings maintained their encirclement. Each family member carried weapons that looked well-maintained and frequently used hunting knives, hatchets, and firearms that spoke of generations spent in violent pursuits. But more disturbing were their expressions, the casual anticipation of people about to engage in familiar, enjoyable work. At exactly 4:27 p.m. on October 16, 1947, Sheriff Coleman Briggs made the third and most consequential decision of his law enforcement career. Instead of attempting to negotiate with the Crane family, instead of trying to reason with mountain folk who had spent 8 decades perfecting human predation, he decided to bet everything on surprise, violence, and the slim hope that 2 Hamilton County deputies might be faster and luckier than their predecessors. But in the lamplit darkness of Devil's Backbone Ridge, with the Cherokee spirits supposedly watching from whatever realm the dead inhabit, Briggs was about to discover whether civilized law enforcement could triumph over ancient evil, or whether he and Stevens would simply become the latest additions to the Crane family's gruesome legacy. Sheriff Briggs drove his elbow backward into Jacob Crane's solar plexus at exactly 4:28 p.m., simultaneously grabbing the rifle barrel and shouting, "Now!" as gunfire erupted in the confined space and oil lamps exploded in showers of burning kerosene. The underground chamber plunged into chaos as muzzle flashes strobed through sudden darkness, illuminating glimpses of the Crane family's shocked faces and Deputy Stevens diving behind the macabre specimen shelves. What followed was 17 minutes of violence that would prove whether 8 decades of mountain predation could be ended by 2 terrified lawmen with service revolvers and desperate courage. Stevens' first shots shattered 3 oil lamps in rapid succession, sending burning fuel cascading across the stone floor and creating pools of fire that cast dancing shadows throughout the chamber. The acrid smell of kerosene smoke mixed with the existing odors of decay and preservation chemicals, creating an atmosphere that burned the lungs and made accurate shooting nearly impossible in the sudden darkness. Jeremiah Crane's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Spread out. Drive them toward the root cellar. The spirits demand fresh blood tonight." Briggs wrestled Jacob's rifle away and fired point blank into the young man's chest, the .36 round, lifting him off his feet and slamming him backward into the specimen shelves. Mason jars containing decades of preserved horrors crashed to the floor, adding the stench of formaldehyde and rotting tissue to the smoke-filled air. Jacob's scream cut off abruptly as he collapsed among the scattered remains of previous victims. "Father!" Ruth Crane shrieked from somewhere in the darkness. "Jacob's down. They killed Jacob." The remaining family members moved through the chamber with the fluid coordination of predators who had spent years hunting in these underground spaces. Their pale blue eyes seemed to catch and reflect the firelight, creating an unsettling effect that made them appear more wolf than human. Isaiah Crane appeared and disappeared in the strobing shadows, like a malevolent spirit, wielding a hunting knife that gleamed with recent sharpening. Stevens emptied his cylinder toward moving shadows, his training overriding panic as he aimed for center mass and maintained proper trigger discipline despite the nightmare surrounding him. One shot found Esther Crane as she attempted to flank their position, catching her in the shoulder and spinning her around with a spray of blood that looked black in the uncertain light. But the Cranes were fighting on familiar ground, and their numbers advantage was telling. Nehemiah appeared behind Stevens, like a ghost, his hatchet raised for a killing blow that would have ended the deputy's life if Briggs hadn't spotted the movement and put 2 rounds into the mountain man's torso. Nehemiah staggered, but didn't fall, his ice-blue eyes fixed on Stevens with undimmed malevolence. "These mountains have been drinking blood for centuries," Jeremiah roared from across the chamber. "Cherokee blood, settler blood, lawman blood. You cannot stop what has always been." The patriarch emerged from the smoke and shadows, carrying an ancient rifle that looked like it dated to the Civil War, but his movements remained fluid and confident, suggesting that advanced age hadn't diminished his capacity for violence. When he fired, the heavy slug shattered stone inches from Briggs's head, sending razor-sharp fragments across his face and drawing blood from multiple cuts. Stevens had found temporary cover behind the wooden table that dominated the chamber's center, reloading his revolver with hands that shook only slightly despite the horror surrounding him. The young deputy had discovered reserves of courage he didn't know he possessed, maintaining disciplined fire against targets that moved through darkness with supernatural familiarity. "Sheriff," he called out, "the stairs! We need to reach the stairs!" The chamber's only exit lay 30 feet away across open ground, swept by Crane family crossfire. Isaiah and Ruth had positioned themselves to command approaches to the stairway, while their wounded sister Esther continued firing despite the blood streaming down her left arm. Jeremiah maintained overwatch from elevated ground near the specimen shelves, his ancient rifle reloading with practiced efficiency. But the burning kerosene was beginning to spread across the chamber floor, and smoke was accumulating near the ceiling in thick clouds that made breathing increasingly difficult. The fire was working in the lawmen's favor, creating visual obstacles that disrupted the Cranes' tactical advantages while providing alternative light sources as oil lamps continued to burn. Briggs made his decision with the cold calculation that 15 years of law enforcement had taught him. "Stevens, covering fire on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark. The deputy rose from cover and began firing methodically at known Crane positions, his shots forcing the family members to seek shelter, while Briggs sprinted toward the stairway in a crouching run. Isaiah Crane intercepted him halfway across the chamber, the mountain man emerging from shadows with his hunting knife extended in a killing thrust. The blade caught Briggs in the left shoulder, slicing through muscle and scraping against bone, but the sheriff's momentum carried him forward into a tackle that drove both men to the stone floor. They rolled through burning kerosene and broken glass, each man fighting for control of weapons that would determine survival. Isaiah's knife hand pressed downward toward Briggs' throat, with strength born of generations spent in physical labor and violence. But the sheriff had learned hand-to-hand combat in the trenches of France, where hesitation meant death and mercy was a luxury no one could afford. He drove his thumb into Isaiah's left eye socket until something gave way with a wet pop, then rolled clear as the mountain man's screams joined the cacophony of gunfire and flames. "Run!" Briggs shouted to Stevens. "Get to the surface. Get help." But as both lawmen reached the stairway and began climbing toward daylight and civilization, they could hear Jeremiah Crane's voice rising behind them in words that sounded like Cherokee, mixed with something older and more primitive, an incantation that seemed to make the mountain itself tremble with anticipation. What they would find waiting for them above ground would determine whether their desperate fight had truly ended the Crane family's reign of terror, or whether they had simply awakened something even worse in the ancient darkness of Devil's Backbone Ridge. Sheriff Briggs and Deputy Stevens burst from the Crane cabin into October daylight that seemed impossibly bright after the underground horrors, their clothes smoking from burning kerosene, and their faces streaked with blood from stone fragments and close-quarters combat. Behind them, the sound of pursuit echoed up from the cellar footsteps and voices that suggested the surviving Crane family members had not abandoned their traditional mountain hospitality. What happened in the next 43 minutes would determine whether the truth about Devil's Backbone Ridge would finally reach civilized society, or whether 2 Hamilton County deputies would join the long list of lawmen who had simply vanished in the Tennessee mountains. Stevens stumbled and nearly fell as they reached the cabin's front porch, his left leg dragging from a knife wound he'd sustained during their underground fight. Blood soaked through his uniform pants, leaving dark spots on the weathered wooden planks as they moved. Briggs grabbed his deputy's arm, supporting him as they navigated the porch steps and began the desperate trek back toward the trailhead. "Can you make it?" Briggs asked, checking over his shoulder for signs of pursuit. "Have to," Stevens gasped, his face pale from blood loss, but his grip steady on his reloaded service revolver. "Someone needs to know what we found down there. Someone needs to stop this." The forest around Devil's Backbone Ridge seemed different now, less oppressive, as if the violence in the underground chamber had somehow broken whatever supernatural atmosphere had made the woods so unnaturally quiet. Birds called from the canopy above, and small animals rustled through the undergrowth in patterns that suggested normal woodland activity rather than the deathly silence they'd encountered on their approach. But behind them, growing closer with each passing minute, came the sound of organized pursuit. The surviving Cranes were following their blood trail with the methodical efficiency of predators who had spent decades tracking wounded prey through these mountains. "Sheriff!" Ruth Crane's voice drifted through the trees, still sweet despite the homicidal intent behind it. "You can't run from the mountain. These ridges have been drinking lawman blood since before your grandfather was born." They reached the old Cherokee Trail after 20 minutes of stumbling through undergrowth that tore at their clothes and aggravated their wounds. The ancient path offered easier footing, but also made them more visible to their pursuers, creating a tactical dilemma that forced Briggs to choose between speed and concealment. Stevens collapsed against a massive oak tree, his breathing ragged and his face gray with shock. "Go on without me," he wheezed. "Get word to the state police. Tell them about the conspiracy. Tell them about Dr. Whitfield and Judge Morrison. "Nobody gets left behind," Briggs said, hauling his deputy to his feet with grim determination. "We both walk out of these mountains, or neither of us does." The sound of pursuit grew louder voices, calling to each other in the mountain dialect, coordinating search patterns with the efficiency of people who had spent lifetimes hunting human prey in this terrain. But there were fewer voices than before. The gunfight in the underground chamber had cost the Crane family dearly, reducing their numbers and disrupting the tactical advantages they'd enjoyed for 8 decades. As they stumbled down the trail toward civilization, Stevens began talking in the rapid, disjointed manner of a man who feared he might not survive to tell his story. "The jars, Sheriff. Did you see the dates on those jars? Some of them went back to the 1870s. Decades of missing people. Decades of law enforcement looking the other way." "I saw them," Briggs replied, his own voice tight with pain from the knife wound in his shoulder. "And I saw the correspondence. This goes all the way to the state level, maybe federal." They reached the abandoned copper mine that marked the halfway point to safety. But both men were moving slower now, leaving a blood trail that would make tracking them simple for anyone with basic wilderness skills. The October air carried the scent of wood smoke from the burning cabin behind them, suggesting that the kerosene fires they'd started were spreading beyond the underground chamber. "There," Stevens gasped, pointing ahead through the trees. "I can see the trailhead." The parking area materialized through the autumn foliage, like a mirage, their patrol car sitting exactly where they'd left it, surrounded by the normalcy of a world that had no idea what horrors existed just miles away in the mountains above. But as they approached the vehicle, Briggs noticed something that made his blood run cold. Another car sat beside their patrol vehicle, a black Buick with government plates and 2 men in suits leaning against its hood. One of them was Dr. Marcus Whitfield from the State Archaeological Department. The other was someone Briggs recognized from newspaper photographs. Assistant Attorney General David Morrison, Judge Morrison's nephew, Sheriff Briggs. Dr. Whitfield called out, with obviously forced casualness, "We heard gunfire from the mountains. Thought you might need assistance with your investigation." The 2 government officials approached with the confident stride of men, accustomed to having their authority respected without question. But Briggs could see calculation in their eyes, the look of people trying to determine how much damage control would be necessary to contain whatever had just happened on Devil's Backbone Ridge. "Gentlemen," Briggs said, his hand resting on his holstered revolver, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. Multiple counts, spanning several decades." Dr. Whitfield's laugh sounded forced. "Sheriff, you've obviously been through some kind of trauma up there. Perhaps you should let us drive you back to town for medical attention. I'm sure whatever you think you discovered can be explained through proper channels." But Stevens had managed to reach their patrol car's radio, and his voice crackled across Hamilton County's emergency frequency with words that would shatter decades of carefully maintained silence. "This is Deputy Stevens requesting immediate backup at Whisper Creek Trailhead. We have evidence of multiple homicides and government conspiracy. Request state police and federal assistance. The Crane family has been murdering civilians with official protection since 1879. The radio transmission changed everything." Within hours, state and federal investigators would descend on Devil's Backbone Ridge, drawn by allegations too serious to ignore. The underground chamber would be excavated, revealing evidence of crimes that stretched back generations. Dr. Fain, Whitfield, and Assistant Attorney General Morrison would find themselves facing charges that would destroy their careers and land them in federal prison. But as Sheriff Coleman Briggs watched smoke rise from the burning cabin in the mountains above, he wondered whether they had truly ended the Crane family's reign of terror, or whether some evils are too deeply rooted in the landscape to be eliminated by badges and warrants. The Cherokee spirits that supposedly watched over Devil's Backbone Ridge had seen white men's justice before. They had watched as previous generations of lawmen made accommodations with human monsters, trading innocent lives for political convenience and social stability. This time, perhaps, the mountain would finally be forced to give up its dead. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.